So when I was a teenager, I really wanted a way of expressing myself creatively, and I never was very much good at drawing. So photography seemed like quite another way of expressing myself in that way. Um, and I've been very interested in video for quite a while. You know, like um, like most people, I've watched Planet Earth, the BBC documentary, and just seen it all and been like, wow, that's it's always magical, right? And was just inspired by the things that are out there that we never get to see, and that these people have managed to create a story from.
Mm.
And I think that sort of storytelling aspect is um, a really important part of why I personally really like photography, is because it's not just art in how I used to think art was, just a visual medium, right? It's not just things that look pretty. It's so much more than that. And yeah, so since then I've been doing photography, and I've really enjoyed it. So I wanted to talk about my COOT series, right? I want to talk about some of the motivations behind it and some of the um, thoughts that went into creating it. Um, and I think it really begins with living in a place. So where I live between two of the royal parks, right? So there's lots of deer, there's lots of quite interesting birds, and lots of wildlife that people come from miles around to come and shoot. And I feel absolutely privileged to have that on my doorstep. And I've done more than my fair share of um, deer images, and the parakeets, especially, they're quite striking. Um, but when I was looking over the photos, they just weren't standing out from the rest. And I found them very fulfilling, and I enjoyed looking at the photos. But I think a lot of people who come to the park are looking for those sort of big names, so to speak. And when I first got a decent wildlife lens, let's say decent, an old Russian telescope lens for my camera. I was just sitting at a pond taking a picture of geese and mallards, very common birds. And the atmosphere of the lens, it was very old, so everything had to be quite dark. Everything was quite claustrophobic, and I absolutely loved it. I love the moodiness. I love the almost alien look to it. It didn't look quite like somewhere on this planet. It looked like they were in an entirely new place, and I absolutely loved that. And I never really followed it on as much as I wanted to. So I headed out to Bushy Park. That's where the photos have been taken. And I went out looking for animals that everyone have seen, right? Everyone has on their doorstep. Even if you don't live near the countryside, I'm sure there is a park nearby. Have some ducks, probably some coots. And I really wanted to be able to take the sort of the majesty and the awe of these bigger animals, the deer and what have you, and apply the same techniques to a more humble subject, right? And I think a lot of people are discouraged from photography because they can't travel to such and such a place. They might live in a smaller town. They might not have the locations they want. And I've definitely had times where I've felt, oh, I wish I could be in, I don't know, Paris or Berlin or Amsterdam, and just go around and see all these new places. And I'm sure a lot of photographers have, but I really wanted to have a project that can have this fine art feel to it while being just around the corner, you know. And that was really important for me, and it, you know, it's reflected in the subject. It's quite an everyday sight, but I like to think they look sort of elegant and graceful in a way that a lot of people don't treat them with that mindset. You know, you think of a swan, an elegant bird, a beautiful bird, and then you think of a coot. Well, that's just a, you know. But I hope my series can change people's mindset a little bit, that you need these big name subjects, you need these inherently beautiful subjects to make something beautiful, to make art, right? And I think, moving on from that, I think wildlife photography as a whole, you know, I've taken a lot of pictures of deer that I think, you know, are nice to look at, but they never quite have the connection that I want with the viewer. So what I mean by that is, almost every photograph should tell a story. It doesn't have to be a complicated story. It doesn't have to be a deep story, but I think it needs to have an emotional connection for the viewer. And I some of my favorite work is when photographers have maybe not humanized the subject, but they have, you know, they have shown that there is a rich internal world, internal lives going on for these animals. After you click the shutter, you know, they go on with their lives like nothing's ever happened. And I think that life is sort of glossed over in wildlife photography quite often. So the series was sort of trying to show the internal lives of these animals, you know, that they have relationships with animals, they have their own goals, their own needs, and, you know, they're not just things to look at, they are their own beings, right? And I think that's quite easy to get confused in your head a bit, you know. So the sort of the encompassing darkness around the animals is meant to sort of represent this internal nature of what's being shown. You know, this is from their point of view, not ours. This is their life, not just an attraction for us to look at, you know. And I think the series itself, when lined up like it is in the gallery, is lovely, because it's these vignettes into their lives. It's like you're just reaching into that experience, and to do that with, you know, like I said, a common bird, and still come out the other side with something that I would quite happily have on my wall, is just it's just a lovely feeling. And I hope that, you know, if people took anything away from this exhibition, or my work in this exhibition, it would be that you don't need to travel the world to make beautiful photographs, and that, you know, animals are more than just subjects, like a building is a subject. If you treat wildlife photography more like portraiture, you're trying to portray the emotions and the goals and the thoughts and the feelings of animals, I think you will start creating truly special images. And it just takes that mindset change away from the mindset I had when I started wildlife photography, and the mindset I find myself having now, you know. And I just hope that people can see that work and, you know, be inspired themselves. You know, that if I can just encourage one person to go out and take photos they wouldn't have taken otherwise, to me that's successful enough, you know. Just knowing that I've touched someone in that way to inspire them. I mean, evolving would be my first word to use there. I don't like the idea that I found my style already, because there are so many options and so many ways your style can change depending on what you're shooting. But I mean, at the moment, I would say I aim for sort of realistic documentary style photography for the most part, with a touch of sort of a cinematic look, right? I like the idea of, something accurately representing what was there at the time, but that doesn't mean it has to look boring. It doesn't mean it has to, not have any creative flair. And at the moment, I'm trying to sort of blend the worlds of fine art and photojournalism and reportage into something that I think would be really engaging for audiences. But that's for photojournalism and reportage, like I said. But let's say with my wildlife stuff, or some of my work with architecture, I quite like to use abstraction when I'm not documenting something. It's I find it very interesting to try and take away as much as you can from a subject while still retaining what makes it, right? So, for example, my COOT work, there is an abstract touch there. That they are still COOTs, they are still birds, but on first glance, they look more like just shapes, or they look like you're really looking into the patterns of it. There's so much of photography is about what you leave out of a photo, just as much as what you put in the photo. And I really enjoy experimenting with that and just seeing how much you can abstract from something and still keep that sort of core essence of what it is. I really like the sort of they almost look like they're floating in nothing, right? And it's almost like their environment is completely stripped away. It is just them, and it is just what they represent. And yeah, I find that a really exciting place my photography is heading towards at the moment. I think my favorite changes pretty much from month to month, but my favorite at the moment is I've got one that unfortunately isn't on my social media yet. It's to debut on my print store that should be opening in about a month, and it's quite a dramatic black and white landscape of Bradgate Park in Leicester, and it's got this huge hill in the foreground, and you just see the expanse of countryside around it, and then you just see a small group of friends just sitting on that hill, and the contrast of the scale of the world around us, and the intimacy of those relationships that you read into these people as having. I know it really hits me. It really gets me, and to be sort of emotionally connected to your work in that way is, it's not something you always feel with everything you shoot. So when something like that comes along, it's just really special. And I can't wait to. I'm getting some sample prints made up for it, and I want to print it properly big, try and get the scale in there. Because the reason I haven't shared it on Instagram or Twitter or whatever is it's just because I don't think you can get that scale, that sense of scale in it. You need to have a bigger medium to properly convey that.
Yeah.
But that should be coming out soon, and I'm really looking forward to that. Couple other landscapes as well thrown in there, which is a bit of a new area for me, but I've really been enjoying it. It's a very different way of shooting, but it's equally as rewarding as some of my more fast-paced work. So it really depends on the genre, but most of my work being photojournalism, I think there's a very fine line between being prepared and going in with certain expectations.
Yeah.
So in a shoot of research location, if let's say I was covering a an activism march, I'd know the route, I'd know where to be. But a lot of people, you see a lot with sort of when people travel abroad for photo trips, they research specific shots, which, I'm sure it works for some people, but for myself, I really don't like to have too much of an idea of an exact shot I want in my head before I go out, because I feel like my best work is a product of the limitations of the location. It's a product of adapting to the situation on the ground, so to speak. And if I went in and I with someone else's picture in my mind, I'm not really creating my own work. I'm creating someone else's work. And obviously there's a very fine line there between going in woefully unprepared and the other extreme. But I find doing less research tends to help me. Tends to make me more spontaneous and a bit more creative in that way. And it helps me avoid some of the more common pitfalls. I think a lot of photography is novelty. Sounds like I'm trivializing it, but it's you're looking for a unique view on something, a unique take, and part of that is novelty, but part of it is being able to be on a shoot and not feel the need to do what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
Which isn't always an option. Sometimes you work with clients, let's say, where they want certain pictures and you take certain pictures. But for when I'm working for myself, I try to avoid research as much as possible. Not being unprepared, but just not going over the top with it. Well, like I said before, a big part of it is uniqueness. I think, your photo is almost by definition not going to stand out if it's very similar to a lot of other pictures. And I think you can have a good photograph that is just pretty to look at, right? Plenty of lovely landscapes or, what have you, that are just aesthetically pleasing. And that can absolutely be a standout photograph. On the other hand, you could also have a great photograph that is great because of the story it tells, the emotion behind it, and the connection that it gives between the subject and the viewer. And I think you can have a good photo with either one of these things, but I think a great photo is a mixture of all three. It's storytelling, it's being aesthetically pleasing, it's being novel and new and unique in a way you've never seen something depicted before, which sounds like a lot, but I suppose that's kind of the point. It's got to be quite a high criteria for it to stand out. It's like I said, it's not to say that a photo that only does one of these things is a bad photo, not at all. But I think there are some truly special photos that are special for those reasons. And it's not a case of either. So with the aesthetically pleasing element, it doesn't have to be a pretty photo, right? You can show something that's typically seen as quite ugly, So I know certain forms of architecture, a lot of people would say that brutalism is typically ugly, but there is still an aesthetic element to that. Even if it's not something typically considered beautiful, it doesn't mean it isn't something that you want to look at more and more and more. So my first piece of advice would be, don't leave your camera on the bus, which I have done before. Nearly set back my photography journey back a couple of years with that one. I'm very much, when it comes to gear, I'm very much, these are tools that serve me before I serve them, right? I'm not saying you need to coddle everything you own, but I am saying just keep an eye on it, please. or get insurance, either or. Just make sure you know, that's not going to end your photography right there. I think what really helped me was identifying why I'm taking photos, right? So a lot of beginner education is geared towards, well, you need to know what all the settings on your camera do. You need to know, you know, the exposure triangle, and you need to know these basic rules of composition, which are all very good and all, I think, have their place and definitely are a help, right? They're worth learning. But I think it's quite often neglected. I think the looking inwardly to yourself, to why you're taking these photos and what you're trying to achieve with them, really helped my photography more than any textbook ever did, more than any tutorial on manual mode ever did. You know, those things are a means to an end, but you need to know what your end is for them to make any difference, right? You know, for the first year or two of my photography, I was, you know, just learning these settings and how the camera worked and this, that, and the other. And I, you know, I'm absolutely glad I did. You know, it helps me express myself the way I want to now. But I really wish I'd been considering the purpose of it all from the very start, because, you know, the more time you can have to reflect on why you're doing this and your goals, I think saves a lot of hassle down the line. And it's not to say that you need to know exactly what kind of genre you need to go into, exactly what stories you want to tell, but it's helpful to just have an idea and sort of base your learning around that, really. I think when a lot of young photographers start doing these styles, I think you're quite often drawn to things that are fairly obvious as being not edgy is not the right word, but sort of out there, right? You know, people go out and they look for tension on the streets, and I find a lot of photographers, when they start out, will see, I know, the homeless people as sort of having that inherent drama to them, right? And it's always bugged me a bit, because street photography, reportage, these are only possible on the basis of if someone is in public and if someone can't have a reasonable expectation to privacy in these spaces, they can be photographed. And I think when you're talking about people who, you know, whose homes are in public spaces, you know, they don't have that option to not be in public, right? And I think it's the case of, if you went into anyone's home, it's common courtesy to ask permission before you start taking pictures everywhere. And, you know, I don't think that means that, you know, there's not a place for photography like that. But I think there's got to be a sensitivity there outside of just the law. You know, it might be legal to do it, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily ethical. It doesn't mean that's how we want photography to progress. I think we need to have boundaries, might not be the right word, but just conventions that we let people know about before they start these things, because it is quite easy to, you know, as a beginner, go out there and not think the ethics of these things through, because you're just not used to it. So I think a bit more education surrounding things like that would really help a lot of young photographers starting out, and it would just save a lot of hassle and a lot of you know, invasion of privacy, really. Well, like I mentioned earlier, I do have a print store on the way. It should be open by the end of September. And I'll have a few select prints I put up there, but I do offer prints of all my work, well, most of my work, depending on the rights and what have you. But I encourage people to just get in touch and let me know if they like any of my photos, would like them on their wall, and I can work with them on that. I quite like to do things more one-to-one than a print run if possible, because, you know, I might come out with X number of prints of X size, but you know, everyone's got different walls, everyone's got different tastes, and you know, I just appreciate people liking my work and wanting my work, and you know, I like to just help out wherever I can in that sense.